Imagine standing in a quiet Louisiana cemetery, the air thick with humidity and the scent of rotting magnolia. It's midnight. The moonlight spills over a row of elaborate marble headstones, each belonging to a member of the same family, the Pembertons. But what chills the blood is not their ornate graves. It's the whispers that rise from beneath them. Locals swear they've heard screams coming from the earth long after the coffins were sealed, coffins that, when exhumed years later, were found completely empty. Tonight, we're uncovering one of the most unsettling tales buried in the swamps of the South, a story of madness, money, and a family curse that refused to die. The Pemberton plantation sat like a sleeping giant along the humid banks of the Mississippi, its decaying pillars and wide porches once symbols of southern grandeur but now heavy with the weight of a dark inheritance. In 1878, the land stretched over hundreds of acres of sugarcane fields, but beneath that fertile soil lay something older, something that breathed in silence and carried whispers through the swamps. Before the Pembertons arrived, the land had belonged to a Creole family known for their healing and spiritual practices. They were not wealthy, but they were respected, sought after by both the enslaved and the free for their knowledge of herbs, charms, and the delicate balance between the living and the dead. When a fever swept through the region, killing children and elders alike, the Pembertons saw an opportunity masked as tragedy. They acquired the land for a sum so small it might as well have been stolen. The surviving members of that Creole family fled, but not before placing something in the soil, a curse, a promise that the land would reject its new owners. The Pembertons were not a family that believed in curses. They believed in control, in bloodlines, in keeping their wealth pure and their secrets purer. Nathaniel Pemberton, the patriarch, was a man of iron will and hollow heart, a former Confederate officer who had seen too much death to believe in spirits. He rebuilt the plantation with the arrogance of a man who thought himself untouchable by the world's darker forces. Yet, as the walls rose, strange things began to happen. Workers complained of seeing shadowy figures moving between the cane rows at dusk. Horses would refuse to cross certain parts of the field. The wells tasted of iron and rot no matter how many times they were drained. Still, the Pembertons ignored the signs, convinced that fear was the disease of the poor. The plantation's wealth grew unnaturally fast. Their sugar sold at prices that made no sense, their crops ripened ahead of season, and buyers came from as far as New Orleans to deal with Nathaniel directly. Rumors whispered that his fortune was not built on trade but on bargains. Some said he had met a hooded figure deep in the swamps, offering blood for prosperity. Others spoke of a ritual performed in the basement of the main house, where Nathaniel and his wife Margaret were said to have sealed their lineage to the land itself. Those who worked on the plantation told stories of hearing chanting from the house on nights when the moon was red and the mist was low. One servant claimed to have seen Margaret drawing symbols on the nursery walls with something dark and glistening, something that was not ink. When their first child, Elise, was born, the midwife, an old woman from the nearby parish, refused to return to the house after that night. She said the child's eyes looked too knowing, too old for a newborn. Within months, the baby fell ill, her cries growing weaker until one morning she simply stopped breathing. The funeral was held that same evening, the coffin sealed before anyone outside the family could see the body. It was an unusual thing, a night burial, but Nathaniel insisted it was what his ancestors would have wanted. The servants said that during the service, the air grew heavy and the ground trembled slightly beneath their feet. They thought it was their imagination, but a few swore they heard the faint sound of a child crying after the earth had already been packed. The deaths did not stop with Elise. Over the next 3 years, 2 more children followed, each one dying young, each one buried in secrecy. The Pembertons spoke little of their grief, though Margaret was seen wandering the garden at night, whispering into the wind as if calling to something unseen. Nathaniel's temper grew wild. He dismissed half his staff and forbade anyone from leaving the property after sundown. He claimed it was for safety, that bandits roamed the woods, but the truth was that he feared the sounds that came with the darkness. The workers said they could hear voices under the ground, low moans that rose and faded with the wind. Dogs refused to go near the family plot, growling and whimpering at the edge of the fence. By 1880, the plantation's wealth had become legendary, but so had its silence. Guests who stayed overnight would speak later of sleepless nights and dreams filled with choking soil. One man claimed he woke to find his bedsheets damp and streaked with mud. The Pembertons' neighbors began to avoid them altogether, saying that something unnatural clung to their presence. Nathaniel's eldest son, Thomas, once a bright and curious boy, began to behave strangely, talking to people who weren't there, drawing graves in his journals, and claiming that his sisters weren't dead, only sleeping somewhere below. When Nathaniel caught him trying to dig near the cemetery one night, he locked the boy in his room for a week. After that, Thomas stopped speaking altogether. Still, Nathaniel would not leave the land. He told his remaining servants that everything the family owned, its power, its life, was tied to that soil. And perhaps he was right. The land had been taken in blood and bound in it, and the Pembertons were only beginning to feel its hunger. The plantation continued to flourish even as the family withered from within. Crops grew taller, thicker, sweeter. The air seemed to hum with life, yet no bird ever nested in the trees near the graveyard. At night, the wind would shift, carrying with it faint echoes that sounded eerily like breathing. The servants started refusing to work after dusk. Those who stayed on did so only because leaving seemed worse. Those who quit were said to vanish before reaching the nearest town. The curse of the Pembertons was not the kind that came in storms or sickness. It was the kind that settled in the bones that waited, patient and unyielding, beneath the soil they had stolen. The land did not forget the desecration, and it did not forgive. The Pembertons thought they could bury the past, but the past was buried alive beneath their feet, clawing upward with every year that passed, hungering for breath, for release, for recognition of what had been taken. When the first of the Pemberton family deaths occurred, the townsfolk expected the usual mourning and ceremony that accompanied the loss of someone from such a powerful lineage. But what they witnessed instead only deepened the shadow that already hung over the estate. The funerals were never public, and not a single outsider was invited to pay respects or view the bodies. The Pemberton servants were ordered to dig graves at night, their shovels muffled with cloth to keep the noise from carrying into the nearby village. No priest was called to bless the bodies, and no hymns were sung. Nathaniel insisted that the family's customs were private, a blend of old Southern aristocracy and ancestral ritual, but those who worked close to the family knew something else was happening behind closed doors. They said that before each burial, the great house would come alive with strange noises, low humming, rhythmic chanting, and the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged down the hallway toward the cellar. Margaret Pemberton, once admired for her beauty and poise, began to change after the deaths of her children. She withdrew from society entirely, refusing to see guests, even longtime friends. At night, her window glowed with candlelight until dawn, and those who passed by swore they saw her silhouette moving slowly, as if performing some kind of ritual dance. The servants who stayed long enough to speak about it later described how the family's parlor had been transformed into something that looked less like a room for entertaining and more like a chapel for the dead. The mirrors were covered with black cloth, and every clock in the house had been stopped. They said Margaret spoke often of preserving the soul, of preventing it from wandering or being stolen. Her voice, they recalled, had grown softer, almost reverent, whenever she mentioned the graves. She claimed the burials were not meant to keep the dead in the ground, but to keep something else out. The night burials followed a strict pattern. At sunset, the family gathered inside the drawing room dressed entirely in black. The coffin, always sealed before anyone outside the immediate family could view it, was carried out by Nathaniel and his eldest son. Torches lined the path from the house to the cemetery, casting long, flickering shadows on the trees that bordered the property. No one spoke during the procession. The only sounds were the scraping of shoes on gravel and the soft weeping of Margaret, who clutched a small bundle of dried herbs in her hand. When they reached the gravesite, Nathaniel would dismiss the servants, sending them back toward the house. Whatever took place after that was seen only by the family. Some said the faint sound of bells could be heard from the direction of the cemetery, though there were no churches nearby. Others reported seeing blue lights hovering above the graves on certain nights, vanishing the moment anyone tried to approach. After each burial, the family's demeanor shifted. Nathaniel grew increasingly paranoid, accusing his workers of spying on him, insisting that someone from the old Creole bloodline had returned to curse his home. He replaced nearly every servant in the household, often without warning, sometimes without explanation. The new staff rarely lasted long. Many complained of sleepless nights, saying that whispers drifted through the corridors after midnight, soft but clear, speaking in a language none of them recognized. Some claimed to have seen Margaret standing near the cellar door in her nightdress, murmuring to something in the dark, her hands pressed against the wood as if feeling for a pulse. One maid swore she heard a child's laugh echoing from beneath the floorboards. When she told Nathaniel, he slapped her across the face and ordered her to leave the house before sunrise. As the years passed, these funerals became ritualistic events that no one dared question. Every coffin was smaller than the last, every burial quieter, stranger, and with each death, the sense of unease on the plantation deepened. The workers began to avoid the family cemetery entirely, even in daylight. They said the ground there felt too soft, as though it were breathing. The air around it was always warmer, thicker, filled with a faint buzzing that made the skin crawl. Nathaniel ordered the area fenced off, claiming it was to keep wild animals away, but even the dogs refused to cross the boundary. At night, lights flickered among the gravestones, pale, wavering glows that moved like candle flames without wind. One servant, a young man named Elijah, claimed that he once peeked through the cracks in the cellar door while the family was preparing for another burial. He described seeing Margaret kneeling on the floor, her hands coated in something dark, arranging bones in a circle. Nathaniel stood over her, chanting words that sounded like a mixture of Latin and something older, more primal. In the center of the circle lay the coffin, smaller than a child's, and inside it was not a body, but bundles of straw and hair tied together with red string. When Elijah told another servant what he'd seen, he disappeared the next day, his belongings left untouched in the workers' quarters. No one ever mentioned his name again. Soon after, the parish priest made an unexpected visit to the plantation, insisting on performing blessings over the land. Nathaniel met him at the gate and refused him entry. The priest, frustrated and unsettled, warned that what the Pembertons were doing would invite something unholy into their home. That night, lightning struck the church steeple in the nearby town, burning it to ash. The villagers took it as a sign, a warning that the Pembertons' curse was spreading beyond their gates. Rumors began to grow that the family was practicing necromancy, that their secret burials were not acts of mourning, but attempts to bind the spirits of their dead children to the house itself. They said the Pembertons believed the soul could not escape if the body never truly rested, and that the sealed coffins were meant to trap more than grief. The strangest part was that no one outside the family ever saw the graves freshly filled. The workers who dug them swore they left before the burial took place, and when they returned in the morning, the earth looked untouched, smooth and level, as though nothing had been buried there at all. Even the coffins themselves were peculiar, each one carved with symbols that did not match any known Christian imagery. Some resembled serpent coils, others the shapes of eyes. It was said that Margaret spent hours pressing her hands against the coffins before they were lowered, whispering words that made the air turn cold. She began keeping jars of salt and bone dust around the house, scattering them near windows and doors. Nathaniel told the servants it was to ward off illness, but no one believed him. By the time the third Pemberton burial took place, the plantation had become a ghostly place where daylight felt dim and time seemed to move slower. Visitors stopped coming altogether, and those who rode past at night avoided looking toward the house. They said it stood like a shadow among shadows, its windows black and unblinking. And every time a coffin disappeared into the ground, a new chill settled over the land, as though the earth itself was reluctant to take what was being offered to it. The first time anyone heard the screams was on a night when the swamp was still, the air so heavy that even the cicadas had gone silent. It was just past midnight when a farmhand named Daniel, who lived half a mile from the Pemberton estate, woke to the sound of what he thought was an animal in distress. It began as a faint wailing, high and distant, rising and falling in uneven waves, and at first he assumed it came from the marshland, but then it grew louder, clearer, until he could make out something unmistakably human in the sound. He opened his window and froze. The noise was coming from the direction of the Pemberton cemetery. It was not one voice but several, tangled together in agony, moans, gasps, and shrill cries that sent a cold ripple through the night air. He said later that it sounded as if the earth itself were crying out. Within days, others began reporting the same thing. The milkman refused to deliver before sunrise, saying that when he passed the plantation at dawn, he could hear faint sobbing beneath the rustling of the cane fields. A group of field workers swore they heard scratching and pounding under their feet as they walked past the cemetery fence, as though someone was trapped below, clawing to get out. Each story fed into the next until the entire parish was whispering of the Pemberton dead who screamed from underground. Nathaniel called the stories nonsense born of idle tongues, but his face told another story. He had not slept, his eyes sunken, his temper quick to ignite. Servants overheard arguments between him and Margaret that filled the house with tension. She would plead with him in hushed tones, saying the voices would not stop until they were set free, while Nathaniel insisted that opening the graves would damn them all. Night after night, the noises grew worse. The screams seemed to come in patterns, beginning quietly, building to frenzied peaks, then dying away just before dawn. Some said they could hear names being called from the soil, whispered like a mother calling to her children. Others claimed to hear laughter between the cries, thin and sharp like the sound of glass breaking. The Pemberton workers began quitting one after another, leaving behind tools and wages rather than face another night near the cursed ground. Even the bravest among them refused to work the fields closest to the family plot. By the end of the summer, the once bustling plantation was nearly deserted, its fields overgrown and its mansion filled only with echoes. Margaret grew fragile under the weight of it. Servants who remained said she wandered the halls barefoot, her white gown stained with mud, as though she'd been walking through the cemetery. She carried a small silver bell wherever she went, ringing it softly as if to drown out the unseen voices. Her hair had turned grey, her eyes hollow, and her once gentle voice trembled when she spoke of her children. She claimed they were calling to her, begging to be let out, and that she could hear them scratching at the coffin lids. Sometimes she would rush from her room in the middle of the night, running into the garden, sobbing that she had to dig them up before they suffocated. Nathaniel would find her kneeling over the graves, clawing at the dirt with her bare hands. He would drag her back to the house, his hands shaking, his face pale with fury and fear. The townspeople began to avoid the road that passed near the plantation altogether. Travelers who had no choice but to cross at night spoke of strange lights hovering among the trees, small bluish orbs that floated above the cemetery before vanishing. Others described sudden drops in temperature, the air turning icy even in the height of summer. A doctor from Baton Rouge who came to check on Margaret stayed only one night before leaving at dawn, refusing to speak of what he had seen or heard. The following week, he was found dead in his home, his expression frozen in terror, his mouth slightly open as though mid-scream. One of the last servants to remain, an older woman named Hattie, told a priest in confession that she had heard the screams not just from the cemetery but from inside the house itself. She said that on some nights, when the wind came from the east, the walls seemed to breathe. There were groans behind the plaster, faint thumps beneath the floors, and the steady scraping of nails across wood. She claimed that the sound came from the direction of the cellar, and when she went down one night to investigate, she found the floor wet, not with water but with soil, damp and black, as though the ground beneath had risen to meet the foundation. She left the next morning and never returned. By late autumn, the plantation had become the center of fear for the entire parish. People spoke of it in hushed tones, as if naming it too loudly might awaken whatever slept there. Nathaniel had taken to sitting by the window of his study through the nights, pistol in hand, staring out toward the cemetery. On one such night, a neighbor who lived across the river claimed to have seen him stumble out into the yard just before dawn, bare-chested, shouting into the fog. The neighbor said Nathaniel fell to his knees, clutching his ears as though trying to block out a sound no one else could hear. When the sun rose, he was gone. Only his footprints remained, leading toward the cemetery fence. After that, Margaret locked herself inside the house. The servants fled, leaving her alone with the sounds that now came every night without fail. The screams had changed by then, less human, more desperate, like the wailing of something caught between worlds. The townspeople began keeping track of the nights they heard it. They noticed a pattern. The screaming always returned on the anniversary of each Pemberton burial. It began softly, a faint moan carried by the wind, then built to a chorus of tortured voices. Dogs howled for miles, horses broke from their pens, and the swamp seemed to shudder with every cry. Years later, when the parish had mostly emptied and the plantation had fallen into decay, travelers would still hear stories about that terrible sound. Some said it was the souls of the Pembertons, trapped and forgotten, reliving their deaths. Others believed the land itself had become alive, feeding on their blood and crying out through the graves. Whatever it was, the people who lived nearby learned to stay inside on those nights, to keep their doors locked and their lamps unlit. They said the screams didn't just come from the ground anymore. They came from the wind, from the walls, from the spaces between the trees where no light could reach, and anyone foolish enough to stop and listen too long would feel a hand, cold and damp, clutching their ankle, pulling them toward the soil that never stopped hungering. When the year 1886 arrived, the story of the Pemberton family had already turned into legend, a whispered curse that the people of Louisiana spoke of only when the night was thick enough to hide their fear. The plantation stood in near ruin, overrun by vines and decay, but the graveyard remained strangely untouched by time. The family plot, surrounded by its rusted iron fence, looked frozen in place, as though the years had not dared disturb it. The screams had become less frequent, or perhaps the people had simply learned to ignore them, to pretend the sounds were nothing more than the wind groaning through the swamp. That uneasy peace shattered the summer a stranger came to town, a federal marshal named Robert Langdon, sent from New Orleans to investigate the disappearance of a Pemberton heir. Thomas Pemberton, the last surviving son, had vanished without a trace. Langdon was a pragmatic man, known for his level head and disbelief in superstition. When he arrived in St. Martin Parish, the locals greeted him with wary silence. No one wanted to talk about the plantation. No one wanted to mention the graves or the cries that came from the earth. But curiosity was stronger than fear, and Langdon was a man who needed answers written in fact, not folklore. He made his way to the Pemberton estate on horseback, riding through overgrown paths where the air was so thick with moisture it felt like breathing through cloth. The gates to the plantation were half open, their hinges corroded, the family crest on them nearly eaten away by rust. As he approached the main house, he noticed the silence, not the ordinary quiet of an abandoned property, but a suffocating stillness that pressed against the ears. Inside the house, time had stopped. Dust hung in the air like fog, the furniture draped in yellowing sheets, and the smell of decay clung to every corner. Langdon found remnants of the family's life, photographs, children's toys, a ledger filled with business transactions that ended abruptly in 1884. There were scratch marks on the walls of the hallway leading down to the cellar, deep gouges as if made by desperate hands. He descended into the basement with a lantern and found the floor stained dark in places, though whether it was from wine, mold, or something worse, he couldn't tell. In the corner, there were broken boards and a strange circular pattern etched into the stone. He copied the pattern into his notebook, not realizing that he had stepped into the center of something far older than the house itself. After 2 days of searching, Langdon decided to speak with the parish sheriff and a few townsmen. They told him what they knew in fragments, each man reluctant to speak too much. They said Thomas had been seen near the cemetery a week before he vanished, digging in the middle of the night. They said he was muttering to himself, laughing and crying all at once, saying that his sisters were alive under the ground. One of the old farmhands claimed he tried to stop him, but Thomas turned on him with a look so wild that he fled. After that night, the boy was never seen again. Langdon took their statements and decided to inspect the cemetery himself. He gathered a small team, 2 deputies, a priest from the parish, and a gravedigger, to assist in the exhumation of one of the family coffins. The priest warned him that disturbing the graves was unwise, that some things were better left untouched, but Langdon was not a man who bowed to superstition. On a grey morning, they approached the family plot. The ground was unusually soft for a dry season, sinking slightly underfoot, and the air had a sour, metallic taste. The headstones, carved from pale marble, were in perfect condition, the names still clear despite the passing years. They began with the grave of Elise Pemberton, the first child to die. The gravedigger hesitated before striking the first blow of his shovel, muttering a prayer under his breath. The moment the soil was disturbed, a foul odor escaped. Not the usual scent of decay, but something older, heavier, almost sweet. It took hours to reach the coffin. The priest refused to look, clutching his rosary so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When the lid was finally pried open, the men recoiled in disbelief. The coffin was empty. No bones, no body, nothing but deep scratches carved into the inner wood, marks made by fingernails. The lining was shredded, the fabric clinging to splinters as though someone had tried to claw their way out. Langdon, shaken but determined, ordered them to open the next grave. It too was empty, the same claw marks etched into the wood, the same torn lining. Grave after grave, the same horrifying pattern repeated itself. Not a single trace of human remains was found. The deputies began to whisper that the stories were true, that the Pembertons had never truly died. The priest tried to bless the ground, but his voice faltered halfway through the prayer. He said he could feel something beneath his feet, something shifting. Langdon dismissed it as nerves, though he too could sense the faint tremor of the earth. When the final grave was opened, a gust of air escaped from it, cold and foul, carrying with it the faint sound of a sigh, or perhaps a whisper. The men dropped their tools and fled, leaving Langdon standing alone among the open coffins. He said later that the silence that followed was worse than the screams he had been told about. It was as if the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The exhumation became a scandal. The parish demanded answers, and newspapers from Baton Rouge and New Orleans sent reporters to cover the story. Some accused Langdon of fabrication, saying that grave robbers had stolen the bodies, while others whispered that the family's curse had consumed them. The authorities sealed off the property, declaring it unsafe, but that did little to stop curious onlookers from sneaking onto the grounds. Those who did claimed to hear strange sounds. Soft thuds from underground, whispers carried by the wind, and on certain nights, faint giggling that turned into screams. The graves, though refilled, never settled. The soil over them remained loose, as if the earth refused to hold what had once been buried there. Langdon returned to New Orleans weeks later, his hair noticeably grayer, his face drawn. He refused to discuss what had happened after the exhumation, but people noticed his hands trembled when he signed his final report. Not long after, he vanished without a word, leaving behind his notebook filled with sketches of the grave symbols and notes about the sounds he heard the night he opened the last coffin. Years later, when that notebook resurfaced, there was one final entry written in his hand, a single line scrawled in haste beneath the drawing of the Pemberton crest. "They are not gone. They were never meant to stay below." Years passed, and the once grand Pemberton estate was left to rot under the weight of its own sins. The swamp began to reclaim what man had taken, its creeping vines twisting around the pillars, its roots splitting through the marble steps. The house stood like a ghost of itself, a skeleton of brick and wood surrounded by whispering cane and stagnant pools that reflected the grey sky. Yet the land never rested. Travellers who wandered too close said they could feel the air grow heavy, hear faint murmurs from the ground, and sense eyes watching from the mist. The locals avoided the place entirely. They said the earth there still breathed, that the wind carried not just the smell of rot, but the faint metallic tang of blood. Every few years, when the storms came, the graves would rise slightly, the soil swelling as if something beneath was pushing upward, hungry for release. By the early 1900s, few in Louisiana even remembered the Pemberton name, but the stories remained, passed down like warnings whispered by firelight. Children were told never to wander near the river's bend where the old plantation lay, never to follow the strange lights that sometimes flickered between the trees at night. Hunters who ignored those warnings often returned shaken, claiming they had heard footsteps in the fog and voices calling their names from the direction of the cemetery. One even swore he saw a figure standing among the tombstones, a woman in a tattered white dress, her hair grey and wild, her face hidden by shadow. When he called out, the figure turned toward him, and though her mouth never opened, he heard her whisper inside his head, a single word that froze his blood: "Stay." The ruins drew attention from scholars and thrill-seekers alike. Occultists from New Orleans made pilgrimages there, bringing offerings of coins, feathers, and bottles of rum, hoping to commune with whatever forces lingered in the soil. Some said the land was cursed by the spirits of those wronged when the Pembertons took it. Others believed the family had become part of the land itself, bound to it by blood and ritual. There were claims that the swamp around the property had turned strange, its waters darker, thicker, as if infused with decay. Fishermen who dropped their nets near the area found them tangled with bones, not animal bones, but human, bleached white and clean as if the water had stripped them bare. In 1923, a team of surveyors was sent to map the area for a proposed levee project. When they arrived, they found the Pemberton house still standing, though barely. The floors were warped, the walls leaning, but something about the structure seemed to defy complete ruin. Inside, they discovered remnants of the family's past, letters half burned in the fireplace, children's toys scattered across the nursery floor, and, in the cellar, the strange, circular carvings that had been reported years before. One of the men, curious about their meaning, traced the symbols with his hand, only to feel the stone pulse beneath his fingers. That night, He awoke to the sound of someone whispering his name from the corner of the room. When he lit his lantern, there was no one there, but the floorboards were damp with fresh mud, and his boots, which he had left by the door, were filled with water. After that night, the surveyors refused to stay on the property. They camped miles away, and even there, strange things continued. Tools disappeared. Maps were found torn or smudged with wet soil. One morning, they discovered deep footprints leading from the swamp to their tents. Prints too small to belong to any of them, but too defined to be animal. The men abandoned the project and left without completing their work. Their report mentioned nothing of the strange occurrences, only that the land was unstable and unsuitable for construction. As time moved on, the Pemberton plantation faded from official record, but those who lived in the nearby parishes swore the curse had never ended. There were nights when the air would turn unnaturally cold, when the fog would thicken and hang low over the ground. Those who ventured too close said they could hear faint tapping, like fingernails against wood, followed by distant sobbing. In the decades that followed, hunters, travelers, and drifters went missing near the area. Authorities dismissed it as accidents, victims swallowed by the swamp, but the old families knew better. They said the land still took what it wanted. By the 1950s, local historians began to take interest in the legend again. A professor from Baton Rouge University visited the site, hoping to write a paper about the folklore surrounding cursed plantations. He brought with him a recorder and several students. On their first night, they captured faint sounds that seemed to rise from underground. Soft, rhythmic thuds, followed by what one student described as a low moaning like someone gasping through dirt. The professor insisted it was nothing more than shifting water beneath the ground, but when they returned to the house the next morning, they found the door to the cellar wide open, though none of them remembered leaving it that way. Inside, the air was cold, damp, and heavy, and on the far wall, new markings had appeared, fresh scratches in the stone forming the shape of a hand. They packed up and left that afternoon, and the professor never published his paper. Decades later, the plantation finally sank deeper into the swamp, its structure collapsing under the weight of years. But even then, the ground would not take it fully. Pieces of the foundation still jutted out from the water like broken bones, and the cemetery fence stood upright, defying rot and time. Locals said that during hurricanes, when the winds were strongest and the rain beat against the earth, the screams would return. They would rise through the thunder, faint but unmistakable, the voices of the Pembertons calling for help, calling for release, or perhaps warning others not to disturb them again. Modern ghost hunters have tried to investigate the site, bringing cameras and recorders, but most equipment fails before they can capture anything. Batteries drain in minutes, compasses spin wildly, and GPS devices refuse to work near the graves. A few have claimed success, saying they recorded faint whispers, a woman's voice repeating the same words over and over, too distorted to understand. One team that visited during a full moon reported seeing figures moving between the graves, pale, translucent shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. They fled before sunrise, and when they reviewed their footage, they found frames filled with static and streaks of light shaped like open mouths. Today, the Pemberton estate is almost gone, swallowed by the swamp, remembered only in ghost stories told by those who still believe the land remembers what it was forced to keep. The locals say the curse has never lifted, that on nights when the air is still and the mist rolls low, you can stand near the water's edge and hear them again, the faint pounding from below, the whispers in the soil, the echo of voices that were buried in empty coffins that never stopped screaming.